So we're going to start out with an activity. What I'd like you to do is turn to somebody at your table, preferably somebody you don't already know, but if it's only people you know, that's great. And here's what I'm going to have you do. I want you to think back to when you were a young person. Middle school, high school, young adult, something like that. And I want you to think back to a time where somebody listened to you. Somebody paid attention to you. Where you recognized this was somebody who saw me when other people didn't see me. Now, preferably, this would not be your best friend who was the same age. This would be somebody of a different age. Whether it could be a teacher, somebody at church, somebody you did when you were riding horses, whatever it is. But think of somebody who listened to you. And then you're going to turn to your neighbor and you're going to tell them that story. And then we're going to, in a couple of minutes, switch and somebody else will tell a story. Okay? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And if you guys just need to have 3, you can do that. It's okay. Thank you. Ask you an embarrassing question. The woman that's sitting with the strawberry blonde hair just next to the guy just sat down to the right of her. I cannot think of her name. Kim. I got it right. And I thought, no, that can't be right. I should have just gone with my gut.
Yeah, she's the elder to youth.
Well, I remember her from the meeting at Mark's house last time.
Yes.
But I couldn't for sure tell, and I didn't want to call her that in public and then have, be embarrassed. Okay, thank you. Okay, if you haven't switch now with somebody else. Okay, we're going to gather back together, folks. So since this is an exercise in listening, let me know if there's somebody at your table where you heard a story and you want to say, I heard a story, I think they should talk about that. So is anybody at your table, where'd you heard a story? Yes, sir.
Ted had a great story that changed his life.
Ted, you want to tell your story?
I will, under duress.
What kind of duress would you like? A long flowing dress?
When I was in college, I hope that counts.
Counts.
I had a physics professor that saw in me the potential to be a teaching assistant for the physics class. And up until that point, I had been performing rather poorly in college. No, it was really awful. But I did have a good time. But at that point, there was a change in my attitude towards school when he had this confidence in me and shared this confidence with me. And that changed the course of the direction that I was going.
And where did you end up?
Here. The pinnacle.
Okay. Anybody else got a story? Yes.
Cynthia told me a story that absolutely touched my heart and made me realize why she has such a depth of heart.
Where is Cynthia? She's not right there. Where'd she go? Oh, there she is. She's got the... There you go.
I was raised in Superior, Wisconsin. My dad was sheriff of Douglas County. We lived in the apartment adjoining the jail. So I grew up with the incarcerated, although I had no business there, but I made it happen. And we lived there 10 years. When I was 8, I went on to college. And my heart has a keen sense for the impoverished, homeless, the incarcerated. And what I learned from that and what I do is I don't lock my house, I leave the keys in the car. I'm pretty level with whoever I come in contact with, and it's a blessing.
That's a great story. Now, I have to apologize. I keep wanting to call her Mrs. Hashbarger because that's how I knew her for all those years. Anybody else have a story? Going once? Come on, somebody's got another story. Okay. I'm glad Ray does.
I have a very special high school track coach and taught PE and coverage throughout 4 years. And we're still in contact.
Wow.
He's up until 85 years old. He was still traveling to Europe to run. And I just saw him at my 6th birthday. That's really showed an interest in almost all of the things. It was obvious that I quit high school in the middle of my senior year as soon as football season was over and went into service. And this man did everything he could. Got me a scholarship offer to COB to stay, and I didn't listen. But he stuck to my mind and still is.
Notice how one of the themes these stories have. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. I have to turn that off. My assistant, that I work with at school, went into the hospital yesterday for emergency surgery. So I had my phone on. She turns out to be fine and all of that. But so I had my phone on. I apologize. One of the things that is a part of each of these stories is somebody saw in me something I didn't see in myself. Or in Ms. Hashbarger's story, she saw in other people things that most of society didn't see in them. We've talked about how leadership begins with listening. But a significant part of listening is seeing things that other people cannot see. So, in a moment, I'm going to do our devotional, and we're going to talk about the Bible. But one of the things that, if I believe that listening matters, and I talk about the things that keep you awake at night, what I have to do is I have to start today by saying, what normally happens in this kind of a situation is, Friday night we have a thing, y'all go home, you sleep, you come back on Saturday morning. It's theoretically possible that some of you might actually have thought about it overnight. And that maybe you have comments or questions. And I want to start with your comments and questions, not with my agenda. And so at least 2 of you have already come up to me with comments and questions. And instead of asking them privately, I said, let's talk about them together. But we're going to start there, and we're going to go as long as those questions take. And then we'll do the rest of what we want to do today. What am I trying to model here? That my schedule is not as important as the people in front of me. Everything we do in church is we've got a schedule. We've got to wait. That's what we do. And I got to say, I'm somebody who lives by a schedule. And so I published a schedule for you so you know what we're supposed to be doing at any given time. And I'm trying to model the fact that what's in front of you is more important. So we've got at least a couple of questions. Who had questions? I can't remember where you're sitting. There's Rocky. I think Oprah here's got a mic for you.
You talk about wanting to say something that comforts somebody, such as, well, you'll get over it, or it'll be better tomorrow, whatever it happens to be. And it seems to me that the problem is we don't know how to grieve. We don't know how to go through the loss process. The Christian church is maybe one of the worst. It's pandemic in American culture. So I wonder if you comment on that.
So, grief. So if I said that, what are you listening for? You're listening for the longings and losses of the people entrusted to your care. The question becomes, what is the appropriate response to loss? Well, to grieve. But it turns out that there's a biblical answer to this question. What does the Bible say is the appropriate response to loss? It is something called lament. There are a whole bunch of Psalms of Lament. How do you know which ones are the Psalms of Lament? They're the ones they don't read in church. If you wanted to find, normally I would tell somebody the way to find a Psalm of Lament, but in the cell phone era it doesn't work as well, because now you have your Bibles on your phones. But back in the day, you had a Bible. I'm sure many of you remember them. If you just opened your Bible and stuck your finger in it, you're probably in the Psalms, right? And if you're in the Psalms, you're probably in a Psalm of Lament. The Psalms of Laments are the ones when they cry out to God. One of my friends down the hall from my office is a guy named John Goldingay. He is one of the top 5 Old Testament scholars in the world. And I want to tell you a couple stories about him and talk to you a little bit about how he responds, how lament is part of his life in a way that cultivates grief, just like Rocky was talking about, how grief is so important. And then we're going to loop that back to the church patio. Okay? So, John Goldingay is an Old Testament scholar. He's from Britain. And he and his wife had kids, and at some point after that, I think when she was about 35, his wife was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And it was really bad. And she eventually became non-responsive. And she could easily have ended up in a home, but what he decided to do was to keep her at home with him. And he took her everywhere. Her name was Anne. So whenever he was teaching, he would wheel Anne in, and she would be in a wheelchair next to him while he was teaching. And just that was a regular part of what all the students recognized. But every night, as part of his dinner routine, he would pray lament on behalf of Anne, because she couldn't pray lament on her own behalf. And what he describes lament as is shaking your fist at God and saying, it shouldn't be this way. You promised it would be different, and it's not, and I'm holding you to it. Are you allowed to say those kinds of things to God? Everything we know about authority figures says the last thing you do is want to make an authority figure mad. The more power they have, the more careful you have to be. The message of the Psalms of Lament is that God can handle your honesty, even and especially when you are angry at God. The message of the Psalms of Lament is that God can handle your honesty, even and especially when you are angry at God. God gives us all of these psalms that are designed to teach us how to say we are angry at God, or to say to things to God that we think God shouldn't know. My favorite one of these psalms is probably one of your favorite ones, you just don't know it. One of the most famous of these psalms is Psalm 139. Anybody here know Psalm 139? You didn't know it was a psalm of lament, did you? It's because we read the edited version. Psalm 139 starts out with, "You have searched me and know me. You know me in my going out, my coming in." And it's 18 to 19 verses of celebrating how well God knows us. I will praise you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. If I were to take the wings of the dawn and to go to the farthest most portions of the earth, there you would be. All this wonderful stuff about God. And then how does it end? "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. And see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in your everlasting way." How is that possibly a psalm of lament? Well, it turns out that we skip 2 verses. It goes for 19 verses, and then there's the 2 that are in the official, if you look in the official Presbyterian Bible, we have skipped them. They come scratched out. I'm kidding. But, it's enough that we don't read those 2 verses. And what do they say? "Oh, that you would slay the wicked." And if you read it in its proper context, it's not just, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked." It's, "I have names. I want you to kill people for me. I am so angry that I want these people dead." Not the kind of thing you say in polite Christian company. Not the kind of thing that you say to a righteous God. Oh, wait, it's in the Bible. So it's 18 verses of saying, "God, you know me better than I know myself, so I might as well not lie to you." 2 verses of saying, "God, I want you to kill people for me." And then 2 verses of saying, "If that ain't right, fix me." That's the whole psalm right there. You know me better than I know myself. I might as well be honest with you. Kill these people for me. If that's not right, fix me. That is not the message that you normally hear when you read Psalm 139. But that's exactly what it is. There is attached to grief, there's a tremendous amount of anger. And we can't separate anger and grief. And so what do? We hide from it. We act as if it's not honest. I want to go back to the Psalms of Lament. The Psalms of Lament are constructed. I'm going to sound like a professor for about 15 seconds, then I'll get over it. There's something called form criticism, where you can look at a psalm and you can say, how is it constructed? And the way that it's constructed sends a message that's more important than the words themselves. You are actually used to that. How many of you have ever gotten a letter from your bank? So I get a letter from Chase Bank that says, "Dear Mr. Cormode." And I look at it and I go, "Oh, isn't this great? My bank thinks I'm dear. They hold me, they must really like me." And then at the end it says "sincerely." So not only were they calling me dear, they were being very sincere when they said it. Is there anybody who believes that my bank loves me? You understand that the form of a form letter is more powerful than the words themselves. The same way with the Psalms. The Psalms are constructed according to a very specific form. And if you were somebody who was writing Psalms back in the day, you would know what these forms meant. And one of the things in a Psalm of Lament is that they have a part of it that's called the complaint, the part where you tell God what you're angry about. And then attached to it is a part where you say, it's a statement of trust, where you say, "I trust you, God." Okay? Those go together. Why is that important? Because we're going to go back to the book of Numbers. the book of Numbers, or starting in Exodus in the book of Numbers, the children of Israel grumbled against God. Do you remember that phrase? Grumbled against God. Actually, it's they complained against God. And that grumbling got them 40 years in the wilderness. There was actually a penalty attached to it, a judge, and you get 40 years. So wait a second. I just told you that there's a kind of complaint that God invites, and there's a kind of complaint that'll get you 40 years in the wilderness. What's the difference? The statement of trust. Absolutely. Psalm 139 says, I trust you enough that I can be completely honest with you even when I'm angry at you. The children of Israel said, we don't trust you anymore. That's a completely different kind of a thing. If I had my way, and it's very clear I don't, but if I had my way, I would make a part of every worship service that the church has a setting of lament. Right now, we typically, as part of our worship service, have songs that we sing of praise. We have places where we confess our sins. All that's appropriate. But we don't have language of lament because we are afraid of grieving. We are afraid of offending God. Now, I want to go back to my friend John Goldingay. Eventually, his wife Ann passed away. And he went a number of years as a single man. And then eventually met a woman named Catherine, and they got married. Well, it turns out that Catherine's daughter is a missionary in Darfur or South Sudan, where all sorts of atrocities are going on. So now, as a part of their regular evening routine, they pray lament on behalf of the people of Darfur, crying out to God and saying, this isn't right. You said you promised things would be different. We're holding you to it. Now, can you see how there's a difference there? There's one kind of lament that is deeply personal. There's nothing more personal than the intimate relationship between a husband and wife. Now they're praying lament over somebody they've never met even. These are the people in Darfur. Another professor that is at our school is a man named Leslie Allen. He's about 87 years old. He's retired at least twice. Saw him on campus yesterday. He still comes to campus. He lives in a retirement community where they cook all his meals for him and all that. Where you would think that's properly retired. That's not the independent living kind of a thing. But every day he gets on his bicycle. He puts on a bright yellow windbreaker and he rides 8 miles to campus. Except some days he doesn't do that. Instead, he rides 8 miles to Huntington Hospital, where he volunteers as a chaplain. Now, he's an Old Testament scholar, has been for 60 years, and writes especially on the writing section, Jeremiah, Lamentations, and the like. So he just published a commentary on the book of Lamentations, where every opening of each chapter that he writes on, he takes a story from being a chaplain in the hospital, and then he uses the language of Lamentations, the book, to talk about that, and then he closes by saying what's the implications of it. So now we see another form of way to use lament, is to care for the sick, for those who are uncomfortable, for those who are in bad situation. Let me give you a final version of this. There's a man named Soon-Chan Ra, who's a professor at North Park University. And he's written a book called Prophetic Lament, where he is somebody who spent a lot of years working in urban settings, especially with African American and Hispanic and Korean American congregations who were trying to work in urban America, where things are much worse off than we like to pretend. And so he wrote a commentary on the book of Lamentations, where he uses the race relations questions in America as a way to talk about what we need to lament. All of that is to say that there are lots of things that we can say and do with lament. There are lots of reasons in our world to lament. And yet that's not a part of the way that we as Christians typically talk to each other. Now, I promised you, Rocky, that I'd end up out on the patio. After church on a Sunday morning, you all end up out on the patio here, right? That's where you get your coffee, you talk to each other. Is that right? Okay. Remember we talked about form criticism? I would bet much of the conversation on the patio is scripted. It's got kind of a structure. I walk up to you and say, "How are you?" And you say, there are only two correct answers to that question, it turns out, in Christian world. One is fine, the other is busy. Those are the only two things that people can say as a way of saying, I'm holding you at arm's length. I mean, now, this morning, I have a cold. You probably have figured that out all on your own. Yet, 3 times people came up to me and said, "How are you doing this morning?" And I said, "Fine." Afterwards, I wondered, why did I bother saying fine when it turns out I've got a cold? Because that's the routine. We don't actually want to know, how are you doing? It is a social nicety. Now, in the hallways, if you're just walking by somebody at work, you can say, "How you doing?" And the correct answer is, "Fine, how you doing?" And then you just keep walking. You don't even stop to talk about that. That's just an engagement that has nothing to do with me caring about you. It's a greeting. It's just scripted. Now we're getting back to what we talked about yesterday about empathy. If I can't have the rudiments of a basic conversation and just simply say to you, "How are you doing?" and have you tell me anything other than fine, there's no way we can go beyond we can't get to longings and losses. So, you're going to have homework today. Some of your homework is going to be on the patio tomorrow. What I want you to do tomorrow is try to have an honest conversation with one other human being. Not your dog, but one other human being. Where you ask them something and they genuinely give an honest response that's not simply fine or busy. Now, how are you going to do that? You're going to listen to them long enough. So, turns out your name is Peter, is that right? So if I say to Peter, "How you doing?" and he says, "Fine," what is something I can do in response to get out of him something other than fine? Yeah. Okay, so we have 2 votes. We have 2 nominations here. One is "you don't look fine." The other is "tell me more." Which would we like to vote for? Yeah, you were joking about the doctor response. Well, one of the things that doctors are trained in nowadays is to be able to handle what's called the doorknob conversation. Do you know what the doorknob conversation is? So you've met with your doctor, and we've had, Susan's my doctor. We've had all these conversations. I'm about to go. I'm about to be done. Doctor is walking out the door. Doctor has handle on the doorknob. And then I say, "Oh, there's one other thing." And the doctor has mentally already moved on. And they want to say, okay, here's the temptation. Keep the hand on the door handle, turn and say, "Talk to the nurse about it," and then to keep going. What they're being taught nowadays is that if that happens, it is likely that was the entire reason for the visit. That there's this thing that I'm not sure I can say, but now that you're walking out the door, I better say it now or forever hold my peace. Think about conversations you're having with people on the patio, when you're talking to people in the hallway, something like that. There are moments when you've already moved on mentally, and then something comes up. All of your momentum is going to want to say, "Keep moving." But I want you to think about that as an invitation. Oh, they've just signaled to me that whatever's they're about to say, that's the more important thing. And you pause for a second, and you have to... Body language is crucial here. They train doctors. You have to take your hand off the door, turn around, walk back to the person, and then say, "Tell me about it." You can't do this thing. Because I'm halfway out the door. Tell me more. We're actually going to cycle back to conversation about grief later this morning. So thanks for bringing that up, Rocky. Other questions, comments? Oprah, can you hand her a mic? Nah, we're going to use the mic.
So last night when Scott told the story of his daughter and her relationship with the couple that drove her was the third time that I had heard that story. I heard it once in a meeting, and then I read it in the book, and then I heard it last night. And it doesn't stop being emotional. Like I have a reaction every time I hear that story. And so I was thinking about it last night. And the thing is, that's what I want, like, deeply and profoundly for my children, selfishly, and then, like, the children of everybody else in here and the children in our youth group. Like, that's what I want for them. But it means that all of us in this room have to like, actively go out and become in relationship with our children, other people's children. And in my experience, most adults are not very good at making friends because we already have friends and we made them a while ago and we're not really into making new friends. And so most of us aren't really very good at it. And also, like, it requires persistent attempts, right? Like, you might try to connect with my son, and then you realize, well, that's not working. Then you got to connect with somebody else, right? And you might have to try that like 8 different times on 8 different students before you find somebody that you actually connect with, which means you've just been rejected 7 other times by middle schoolers, which is extremely, it makes you feel bad about yourself. But so like,
that's just a normal day for Lori.
Yeah. So like I'm hopeful because I see those relationships happening with students in our group and with people in this church. But I also am not hopeful because I know it's really hard. And so I have belief and I have unbelief, and that's what I need help with.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
This is the root. If nothing else you hear today, I want you to hear what Kim just said. Lori wants to say something before I say anything more, because this is our resident expert on middle school kids.
Hi, my name is Lori, and I'm a middle school teacher.
Hi, Lori.
And like AA, excuse. Hi, Lori. Yeah. I'm quite proud to say I'm a product of Community Presbyterian Church, and so are our daughters. And I am also a closet introvert. I have to put on my show face to do 3 shows a day at Anacapa Middle School. And actually, let's take a poll. How many of you have been teachers at some time in your life? Yeah, and you know what it is? If you feel that you are an introvert, you'd rather be a book nerd at a library, but you have to put on your show face in order to inspire. When I'm out in the patio, I've had such saturation from the week, I don't want to go out and extrovertly say, hi, how are you? Can I engage in a empathetic conversation? So to go out and find more of the people that I work with and to initiate an extroverted conversation and to establish a relationship that would be long-term is uncomfortable.
And exhausting.
However, in soaking through the message of your leadership, pre-leadership training from last night, I had to come to grips with, is it myself or altruistically do I reach out? And you know what the answer is. And that's hard, because I want to be a taker on Sunday. I don't want to be a giver. Sorry, Mark. But it's not about me. It's about us and community. And that is a constant reminder for myself. So, Kim, I would be honored to partner with your girl to establish a relationship, as I would with the marshal's daughter. And anyway, I just wanted to add those thoughts regarding being introverted and extroverted, and it's a conscientious effort on Sunday mornings and beyond.
So for how many of you did that resonate? That Sunday morning, I just don't need one more thing to do. Especially somebody inconvenient. I've got my friends. I want to talk to the people that I want to talk to. And once I talk to them, I want to just get on with my day. Do you know that moment? I know that moment. I teach this stuff and I know that moment. It's a good thing my wife's not here today because she knows that I know this moment because she's the one that's constantly having to kind of kick me and say, no, go back and practice what you preach. What's the name of this church?
We should say the church.
The solution to this problem is to change the name. Most churches have designated extroverts, whose job it is to go and compensate for the rest of us. But yeah.
Had Christ parked his empathy, there would have never been a church.
Had Christ just parked his empathy, there would never have been a church. Now, it's easy for us to say, oh, yes, he was one of the designated extroverts. We'll call him that. Bill. See, this is great. I told you we'd get to the point where I couldn't get a word in edgewise. This is great. I'm loving this.
In a couples group a week ago, a lady in the group said something, and I had a teachable moment, and that was you look for opportunities to share grace. Now, that takes on many different faces, situations. Second point, I know what it means to come to church and be peopled out. Mm-hmm. I also know what it means to come as an elder and have an agenda and people I have to talk to. Yes. Dang, got to get through that checklist or I can't get my job done. Anyway, Jesus is my most beautiful example. He takes time out to pray to the Father, to be alone, to go on the mountain and be alone. And I really appreciate being authorized to do that. Now that I'm retired, I do it lavishly without as much need to mend. But I respect that. And to connect with somebody is a beautiful thing. If it interrupts my quiet time, it must be intended to be.
Anybody else? Okay, we got one more. This is great. I'm loving this.
Gary's getting his steps in. I think also it's important to be the person that doesn't say fine. So I think it's important we don't just ask somebody how they're doing, but to say, I'm having a hard week. And so I'm not so much of an introvert, but for the introverts, I think it's important to say it's okay to take that Sunday. And when somebody asks you how you're doing, to say, I'm not feeling great, because you are being vulnerable, and I think vulnerability is important as well as empathy.
One of the things that I've found is that the power of the ritual is so strong that if I want to be that guy that breaks it, I have to turn to the person and say, you asked me how you doing. I would have to say, do you have time for me to tell you a story? I actually have to ask permission to break the rules. Because otherwise, Bill's got his agenda here, and he's here talking to me about, he's, how you doing was the opening line of, and I need you to do something for me. And now all of a sudden I'm taking him seriously. That's not going to work at all. So, okay, we got another comment. Yeah. So if you're at the bank and somebody asks you how your day, you got to ask permission. But something that Bill was saying is absolutely crucial to going back to where we're going to end up today focusing much of the day on what Kim has been asking about, how to partner with kids. But you know that moment when either you're peopled out, or it's one of those moments when you've got an agenda. You got stuff you want to do. You know that moment? And I go and I talk to somebody, and I've got something I want out of you. That person has stopped being a person, and they are something, they're a tool for me. They're something that I need in order to accomplish something. When we transform people into tools, we dehumanize them. I am really good at that. I can give you lessons on how to dehumanize other people because I got stuff I want to get done. And I need, I see the world in terms of the roles that they've got and how we're going to get stuff done. So eventually we're going to loop back to Kim's question about how do we partner. But I'm actually going to move on now, if that's okay. And we're going to go back to the agenda. Now, my personality is such that my agenda is calling to me. I got stuff I want to get done. Which is more important? What's in the room here? If we don't get all the way through my agenda, I just got to live with that. Because what's happening here is more important. Why? Because you are chewing on this stuff and you're making it your own. I've got this stuff I want to tell you, and I know cognitively it's better for you to chew on it. But I got my stuff. It's just like out on the patio. I've got to model this. So I want to take about 10 minutes and do my devotion. And then I have been told by many people that it is important for us to take a break every hour. We will do that. My mother's got you covered. So if the pastor and your mother both team up on you, you got to go with that one. So we're going to go about 12 more minutes, and then we're going to take a break. So I want to start by talking to you about, I teach leadership. That's my job. So people at some point want to ask me, what do you think biblically about leadership? And for me, I've got one verse that I use that captures how I think about leadership from a biblical perspective. And it's 1 Corinthians 3:6. 1 Corinthians 3:6, you don't have to look it up. I'm going to quote it for you. It's not a long verse. It says, Paul planted, Apollos watered, and God gave the increase. And it's at the beginning of 1 Corinthians where the Corinthians are in a controversy. And there's a faction that's in favor of Paul. There's a faction that's in favor of Apollos. And Paul tries to explain to them that the whole point of this is not the factions. So we've got three characters in this story. Paul planting, Apollos watering, and God giving the increase. Which of those three characters is most important? Please say God.
Teachers who give the answers.
Yeah, I mean, can we agree that God is the most important in that story? Okay, I got votes for God. Good. Why is that important? Because everything we're talking about today and last night is about planting and watering. We do planting and watering, but it's God that gives the increase. So I want to tell you a story about my grandfather. My grandfather was what the Bible calls a steward. He ran a 140-acre ranch, a citrus ranch in Simi Valley for an absentee landlord, somebody who owned the land but didn't farm it. And so he ran that ranch. And he spent his days planting and watering. Could my grandfather guarantee a harvest? Would he be held responsible if there was a bad harvest? Wait a second, so you just told me that he was responsible for something that we knew he couldn't control. Yep. So what could he do? He could construct an environment for growth. That's what planting and watering is. And all we're going to work on today and last night is about how to construct an environment for growth. We can't guarantee that God will do anything. That's not our job. Let me tell you about some of the things that my grandfather did. He made sure that the soil was good. He made sure that there was lots of water. But many of you are old enough to know a certain smell. Do you know what who said that? The smell of a smudge pot. Do you know what that is? That there's a certain time of year when the temperature starts to dip. They now use wind machines, but what they used to do is they take this fat pipe filled with kerosene, motor oil or kerosene, and they would light it, and it would give off this oily haze. Now, I used to think that the whole point of a smudge pot was to, well, you're burning stuff in the orchard in order to elevate the temperature, right? That's not actually how it protected the trees. It raised the temperature a little bit, but it gave off this oily haze, this kind of black, thick smoke, and that coated the leaves of the tree, and that made it so that they wouldn't freeze. Now, let's say your job is to spend all night tending your smudge pots, walking around and making sure that that thick, oily haze is still billowing out. What will you look like in the morning? It's not pretty work. Yeah, you'll look like a dipstick. I'm going to use that line from now on when I tell that story. But did your trees survive? Is it worth it? I want you to picture that. What you're signing up for when you talk about caring for young people is you're going to be tending the trees in the same way that my grandfather tended his trees. Some days it's a glorious day when you're out in the sunshine and you think this is the greatest job in the world. And some days you're tending smudge pots and you're covered with a thick, oily haze and you think this smell is never going to go away. Now, my grandparents, they lived for their trees. And eventually, in about 1960, they moved off the ranch, and they bought a house out in Simi. And it wasn't really they bought a house. It was a little house with about a dozen giant citrus trees next to it. It was more they bought a bunch of citrus trees and put a house next to it. And up until my grandmother was 103 years old at one point, when she left the house, she was still tending her trees. At one point at 103, she would get her walker, and she would go out there, and she would be irrigating her trees. That was just what she did. And because she had about a dozen trees, maybe 18, depending on how you counted, and it took about a day to irrigate each one, she spent about half of her month, every month, irrigating her trees. So if I'd call her up, I'd say, "What were you doing today?" She'd say, "Irrigating." Now, we're talking about a 101-year-old, 102-year-old. You know, she's no longer able to drive, but she's still out there with her walker irrigating her trees. Why? Because that's who she was. You couldn't just tell her, "Don't do that anymore." She lived for her trees. So Paul planted, Apollos watered. Grandpa smudged, Grandma watered, and God gave the increase. You need to be convinced that all you can do is plant and water. You cannot get a guaranteed outcome. There were some years where the winds came just at the moment when the blossoms were on the tree, and they blew the blossoms off the tree, and they didn't have very much fruit that year. Is there anything a citrus farmer can do about that moment? There's nothing you can do. And there are some times when there was extra water and extra sunshine, and there was just an enormous harvest. God gave the increase. We're going to talk about how to plant and water in such a way that God, so you can hand things over to God to give the increase. So, I have one more question before we take a break. Are you the kind of group that would like me to lie to you or to tell you the truth? But Well, I'm not so sure. Let me tell you what the question is. I'd like us to take a 10-minute break. Are you the kind of group I need to tell you to take a 10-minute break and you'll be back in 10 minutes? Or you're the kind of group I need to take a 5-minute break so that then we can start in 10 minutes? So I was talking to Susan, and she was saying that, you read this stuff and it sounds so easy, it sounds so quick, but it can't be quick. Yesterday we were, I think I told you that at Fuller we were hosting the first cohort on Growing Young that was there, 40 churches. And we had the coaches that were up there that were, we had 5 of them. I told you about Jeff Matisich. One of them was Lisette Frazier, who's from Fellowship Monrovia. And then another one is Matthew DePrez, who's now, he's left his church to come and work for us, and he's the point person that connects up to Growing Young. And they were asking the coaches about how important it was, what was common mistakes that they had made, that kind of thing. And one of the things Lisette from Fellowship Monrovia was talking about is Eugene Peterson's got this book called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. And that what it takes to do this well is to keep moving in the same direction. And Matthew DePrez talked about how he was a part of one of the first Sticky Faith cohorts back in 2011. And when he came to Fuller and we, with his congregation, one of the things they did is they wrote down an idea at that point, and they were really excited about it. They finally implemented that idea in 2015. It took them 4 years of stumbling forward until they finally got to the point where they could implement the idea. And he says it was a great idea and it worked. You need to know, I believe in organizational momentum. Just moving forward is all that we can ask of you. Just taking the next faithful step. It's not something where you can say, let's force it and make it go fast. Most of this stuff goes slowly, haltingly, difficultly, but if you just keep pointed in the right direction, eventually you'll get there. But if you become impatient, 3 of you have already come up to me today and talked to me about yesterday when I mentioned about the mistakes that I tend to make are become impatient or embarrassed. So now you know, 3 of you have already come up to me and said, that's what I needed to hear. Because the thing that gets me discouraged is when I become impatient or embarrassed. Just keep moving forward. That's all you can do. So, I'm going to go back to this outline that's been calling to me, if that's okay. Because if you turn the page, you're going to get to see point 1, keychain leadership. We've now been talking for over half of our time together, and I've made it to point 1. Reminds me of the pastor that when I worshiped at church in college. There was a guy named Don Williams who was the pastor of the church across the way, and we went to that Presbyterian church up on Mount Soledad, and he would preach for about 45 minutes at a crack. That was how long a sermon was at his place. But he was a very dynamic preacher, but unruly would be probably too kind. At one point, we did a 10-week series on the 10 Commandments that lasted a year and a half. Including 6 months on the 5th commandment of honor thy father and mother. I remember one point he got up there and said, okay, before I get started, I want to tell you a couple of things. And then we talked for 45 minutes, and he says, okay, so we're done for today. Next week we can get started. That's just, why did he do that? Because he was very sensitive to the Spirit. And that his schedule wasn't as important to him as the Holy Spirit. I find that very uncomfortable. I have my nice plans. I don't know where Sandy is, but one of you came up to me last night and said, I lead a Bible study or a study group that talks about the sermon. Can you tell me what you're going to be preaching on? So what did I do? I sent her a manuscript of what I was going to, what I'm currently thinking because, I've already got way too much material to talk about. I'm very well scripted. That creates success in our churches. It also can be a terrible weakness, because when you're sitting with somebody in front of you, you need to listen to them. So we're going to kind of talk through, here's what I'd like to do, is I'm going to try and talk through the 6 core commitments by 11. We'll take a little break, and then I'm going to talk to you about organizational change, and we're going to talk about how to implement all of this, and we're going to go until maybe a little after 12, and then about 12:15 we're going to break and we're going to have dinner or lunch. Does that seem like a good plan for y'all? So there's at least one more break in your future before we get to 12, okay? So I want you to turn to the page that says Keychain Leadership. We talked about how Growing Young was constructed by doing a deep, deep dive into a dozen churches that were very, very good at caring for young people. And in one of those churches, they encountered a guy named Stretch. That's actually what everybody just called him. They just called him Stretch. And they asked him, how did you get involved in doing all this stuff? He said, well, when I was about, I think it was 14, 15 years old, he had been doing things at the church, just regular stuff. And they turned to him and they said, we want to give you some responsibility. He said, okay. They said, see that soda machine over there? And they said, yeah. It's going to be your job. That's going to be your soda machine. And what they did is they gave him 2 keys. They gave him the key to the building, and they gave him the key to the soda machine. And his job was to stock the machine and to take the money out of it and to make sure it got to the church office. How often would you let a 15-year-old boy have access to money and unlimited amounts of soda and expect that to go well? That's not how we do things. But the principle of keychain leadership is that we hand over responsibility to young people. When Jeannie and I were talking about this, we immediately thought of some friends of ours. They were, once upon a time, missionaries in a foreign land, and they have 5, 6 kids. I lost count of them all. And they have a rule in their household that the chore that needs to be done will be done by the youngest kid that can possibly do it. Okay, that makes sense. But here's what they did. For example, the 5-year-old's job was to empty the dishwasher and put away the dishes. Wait a second. That would never work in my house. 5-year-olds couldn't be trusted with that. We have breakable dishes that go up on shelves that a 5-year-old couldn't reach. So what did they do? They had plastic dishes, and they put them in shelves that were low enough for the 5-year-old to reach them. They had to change the way they do things in order to accommodate this rule that says we're going to let the youngest person that can possibly do it do that task. At my household, we would have said we would never change the rules. We would never buy new dishes. We would, that would just, we can't do that. I love that metaphor for the church. There's lots of stuff that younger people can be doing, but not if you keep doing things the way you've been doing them. Excuse me. Let me give you another example. This happened at my own church. There's a woman there who named Connie who's in charge of caring for the homeless. And when it was a Sunday morning, and she was there early because there was a couple that had come to the church and asked for, basically they were homeless and they wanted to see if we could help them out in some kind of way. And they were in their about 23, 25 years old, named Raul and Sonia. Oops. I called them Ruben and Sonia to change their names, but I actually, I did. Yeah, his name's Raul. I try to change their names in public, but in this case, now you know. And so Raul and Sonia show up at the church, and Connie's caring for them, and she provides for them some vouchers so they can get some food and some vouchers so that they can get some temporary housing. But she goes out to the van where they're living, and she sees 2 things. One is that they are young parents. They have an infant. The second is that in the back, Raul's got some music equipment. They ask him a bit. And so what does she do? She starts a conversation. Tell me more about this music equipment. Well, turns out Raul plays bass. She turns to him and says, would you like to play bass in our church praise band today? Sure. So they get the bass out of the car. When the praise band gets there to church, she introduces him and says, excuse me, this is Raul. He plays bass. Let him learn some songs. And he played bass that day. Now, I tell this story in churches, and there's like, you can't do that kind of thing. Are you kidding me? We have practices. There's a routine for this kind of a thing. Think of all the things that could go wrong. Think of all the things that could go. We haven't vetted this person. So what? And now I tell you that 2 years later, Raul and Sonia they're in a home or an apartment. He only got a job. He now has quit that job and gotten a second job that's even better. And he's a regular part of our praise band. Sonia teaches in our Sunday school program. And they are some of the best evangelists that we've got in our church. The baby's 2 years old and now doing great. Just growing. Okay, so, what's that? You're putting the dishes away. That's a different. So here's my question. What would it take for such a story to exist at this congregation?
Why is Mark laughing?
Because here's what we believe in the Presbyterian Church. We believe in professionalism. We ask our clergy to be trained. We ask our musicians to be trained. We believe that we honor God by being our best. All of that is very good. But sometimes it gets in the way. Let me give you an example of where it gets in the way. I told you I teach adult ed at my church. It's normally me or my friend Steve, who is a world-class theologian, a philosophy professor, and one of the founding members of the Society of Christian Philosophers. So, he's been on the cover of Christianity Today. So, that kind of thing. We have a biblical theologian who is a professor at Azusa Pacific, and a historical theologian who is a professor at Azusa Pacific. Those are the four of us that teach adult ed. We're an ethicist short of being able to start our own seminary. All that's great. I told you that part of the reason that I have such a high view of adult ed is I remember Dick Power at this church and the way in which he inspired a congregation. But there are people that feel left out. There are people that would like to be in adult ed, that this is a little highfalutin for them. Whose fault is that? Whose responsibility is that? I'm in charge of adult ed. I've got to figure something out. So I started having a conversation with one of our friends named Johnny, who was a former InterVarsity staff worker. And what we agreed on is what we're doing right now in our church is we have what we call exploration groups. And we have 8 different, essentially, adult ed classes / small groups going on at once right now. Some of them are for brand new Christians, people who are either never understood Christianity, that whole, where's the Old Testament thing? Any of that. That one's taught by the historical theologian. We've got one that's an advanced thing on the nature of the resurrection, taught by the philosopher. And we've got a dozen people signed up for that. And we've got a parenting class. We've got all these different iterations in between. It turns out that was controversial in my church. Because what we do best is professionalism. And we can't let some of these just random people teach a class? What if they say something wrong? It took the power of the two of us that are seminary professors to say, no, we think it's important that everybody get a chance to teach. Because that professionalism became so powerful that it was shutting people out. Your greatest strengths can become your greatest weaknesses. What would it take for this congregation to be able to let Raul play in the praise band after just meeting him as a homeless person? I would love for that story to become viral in your congregation. I would love for you to find somebody tomorrow morning on the patio. Somebody will say to you, "What's new?" And you'll say, "I was at this thing this weekend. Let me tell you one of the stories." And tell them that story. Because if you can plant enough language, eventually that story becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Eventually that becomes something where you can talk about it enough, you go, okay, we could try that. So what I just told you is, A, you're going to do this on the patio, but B, the more important thing is, how do you create change in a system that is well established? You keep telling stories and that you invite people to live into them. One of the stories that will change you is if you can tell the Raul story. Another one, Mark tells me that he's told the story about Albie Moe, about looking for diapers on the line, and about how your future is embedded in your past. We're going to be Albie Moe's church. We're going to go out into the community, and we're going to go listen. That's a story you can tell. We're going to start accumulating stories. There's a group of about 12 of you, I think, 15 that are working together on how to help this place go forward. One of the things I'm going to encourage you to do is every time you meet each month, pick one story, and your goal is to get it to go viral in your congregation. Just keep telling people, and they keep telling people until everybody knows it. You'd be shocked at how much change you can make in a year or in 4 years if you just start accumulating those kinds of stories, the kinds of things that everybody knows. I want to tell you one other thing. I mentioned to you that Sonia became our best evangelist. To do that, I'm going to have to sound like a professor for just a moment again. I want to tell you about some sociological research called the strength of weak ties. They talk about how do organizations grow. Organizations grow by the people that are least committed to them. You would think the best evangelists would be the people that are closest to the center, the kinds of people that are in church every Sunday. You'd be wrong. Why? Think about you folks. You folks are the people that are the leaders of the church. How many people do you know that aren't Christians? Most of your close friends are already Christians. It's the people that are on the boundaries. It's the people that are the border between insider and outsider. Those are the ones that are the best evangelists. And so when Sonia said to her friends, some of whom were also homeless, look what this church did. They not only just gave us a voucher for some food and kicked us on our way, but they listened to us long enough that they actually invited us to come and be a part of them. You know how powerful that is? Bill.
Question. I love that idea. It's inspiring. Your church has stories. Get them out there. And that's an... Oh, thank you very much.
You'll be on in a second.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Just keep going. It'll come on eventually.
That's empowering to the congregation, to the members. It grabs their heart. How do you disseminate it? How do you initiate that going viral?
How do you disseminate it? How do you initiate it? Well, the first thing you need is a group whose job it is to decide on the story. Turns out you've got one. You know, this group that meets at Mark's house, okay, you've got that group. And then you've got to have a story that you agree on, okay? And then it just starts with 12 people telling everybody they know. So how many times have you ever been to a place where you see somebody and they say, how you doing? And you said, fine. What if you instead said, oh, I heard the greatest story the other day? Nobody says, no, please don't tell me a story. You tell them that story. And then you do that with enough people that you are centrally located within this church. And you do that with enough people, that story will start to bubble up. And you do it for a month, what will happen is by the end of the month, everyone will feel like, oh, I've heard that story everywhere. That's when you know you've succeeded. You could post it on Facebook. You could, send it to your friends. You could, every time you have a chance to have a conversation with somebody, it is extremely low maintenance just to tell them a story. You're not going to ask them for anything at the end of the story. You're not going to try and sell them something. You're not trying to say, I've got Amway products for you. All you're doing is you're just telling them an interesting story. You tell enough interesting stories, and it can change the direction of the church, because all of those stories together become a shared story of future hope. I'm going to keep moving if that's okay with you. We did empathy last night, so I'm going to turn the page and go to Jesus' message. Y'all find that? So one of the things that's important is for every church that is making a difference with young people to put an emphasis on Jesus' message. Aren't we glad we did that? I mean, it'd be kind of disappointing if in the end we found Jesus wasn't important. But I got to tell you, now, most of the time when I'm talking to a congregation like this, I will say, I don't know your congregation. In this case, I do know your congregation. And so I can tell you that we had, many of you filled out an assessment of the church where we ask you questions about how you deal with young people. I told Mark, I knew how this was going to come out before I saw the numbers. Because it turns out you're a stereotype. We've got a bunch of churches that are just like you that have taken this. And I knew exactly where you were going to be. Because I could say, you're like these half a dozen other churches that are, most of them are part of ECO. They are larger than an average church. They're not mega churches. They're kind of in that middle ground there. They're churches that once had very large, thriving youth groups, now probably have a little bit less than that. I could go on and on talking about how you're a stereotype. But one of the most important places you're a stereotype is in your misunderstanding of the gospel. I don't mean your misunderstanding as far as if we gave you a quiz, you would misunderstand it. What I mean is if somebody on the outside was looking at the gospel that this church represents, they would have a distorted view. Let me explain. One of the things that we talk about is fewer abstract beliefs and more about Jesus. It turns out that people who are not regular insiders need to hear fewer things about doctrine and more about how Jesus changes their lives. I have a quote here from a guy named Robert Withnow. Robert Withnow is the leading sociologist of religion. He knows more about religion in the United States than all the other sociologists. I mean, we can debate about who's number two. No one debates about who's number one. At one point, he wrote 13 books in 12 years, and they were all good. It was embarrassing for the rest of us. Now, what you need to know about a sociologist is sociologists have rules. And one of the rules is you can only be descriptive. You can't be prescriptive. You can only tell what's happening in the world. You can't tell people what to do with it. That's one of the rules. You're a bad sociologist if you start to tell people what to do. The problem is he's a good church member. He's a member of Nassau Presbyterian Church in Princeton. And enough of his friends came to him and said, you know so much about American Christianity, you have an obligation to write a book where you tell us what you really think. And he's freaked out by this. He says, I can't do that. I'm a sociologist. We can't tell people what to do. So he finally published in 1996 a book called The Crisis in the Churches. And the opening section of the book is kind of comical. Because over and over again, he says in about 17 different ways, I'm not a sociologist in this book. Please don't judge me as a sociologist. I will tell you what I think, but I will use my learning, but recognize this is not a sociology. He says it over and over again. And he says, I can tell you where the problem lies in American Christianity. It lies with the seminaries and the pastors. In other words, people like me, the people that train pastors and the pastors that preach. And here's why. We spend too much of our sermons, too much of the message we proclaim to the people on two things: abstract doctrine and culture wars. He says those are the things that are mildly important, but they're not nearly as important as the things that make up people's everyday lives. So where did I get this idea that I told you last night about the things that keep people awake at night? He was talking to Robert Withnow. He was reading his book on the crisis in the churches and recognizing that the number one problem is that we don't preach on everyday issues. And what's getting in the way for us doing it? It's our professionalism. We know that there's this good doctrine out there. We know there's right ways to do things. We've got all this stuff. It's not that that stuff is wrong. It's that it's irrelevant to most people. They would rather us preach about the things that matter most in their lives. Now, instead of preach, let's talk about how do you talk to your friends. It's not about doctrine. It's not about culture wars. It's about the things that keep people awake at night. Very few people lay awake at night thinking about doctrine. Very few people, I have friends that do, but they're professors. What's that? They all go to church here. Very few people lay awake at night thinking about culture war issues. Although you would think that by the news and all that, that those are that important. That's not what keeps people awake at night. What keeps people awake at night is what's going to happen with my kids. Why isn't there anyone in my kids' lives besides me? What keeps kids awake at night? Identity, belonging, and purpose. Those kinds of issues. I would argue that's probably true for 35-year-olds and 75-year-olds too. Those are the things that form the message of the gospel. And for us, it becomes much more about grace than about obedience. We want to say the gospel is about obedience. This is what you're supposed to do. And we accidentally end up preaching a Pharisee's gospel that doesn't have enough grace. Do y'all know the name Dallas Willard? Dallas Willard's written a number of books. He's passed recently. Written a number of books on Christian spirituality. He was a philosophy professor who then focused on Christian spirituality. And if you asked him what was the number one symptom of unhealth in the Christian church today, he would say that we preach what he calls a gospel of sin management. That somehow the good news is that you can manage your sin. And that it can become chronic, like a disease. Who was the last group that preached a gospel of sin management? It was the Pharisees. They say you could manage your sin to the point where you could control it, and it would no longer be a problem. We've gotten to the point where we as good Christians are afraid of grace. Why would we be afraid of grace? Well, might have to give it, but even worse, it's because there's a lot of research that talks, a lot of scholars that talk about the difference between what would be called legalism and antinomianism. How's that for a word? Antinomianism. Anti, against. Nomos is the Greek word for law. So antinomianism is against law. And it's the part of Romans where it talks about how they're so worried about the fact that people, if they take grace seriously, they go, great, we can just keep sinning and God will always forgive us. There's nothing to hold us back. So the question becomes, what are you more afraid of? Are you afraid of legalism or antinomianism? Both of them are wrong. Are you more afraid of too many rules or not enough rules? Are you afraid of too much control or not enough control? And here's what the scholars will tell you. Without knowing you, I can predict what you're more afraid of by asking this question. How much power do you have in society? The more power you have in society, the more you are afraid of not enough rules. And the less power you have in society, the more you're afraid of too many rules. Because the more power you have in society, the more you have ability to control the rules to your advantage. This is a upper middle class Anglo church in suburban America. You got a ton of power. So without even knowing you, you and all your stereotypic friends are going to be far more afraid of antinomianism than you are legalism. Grace is going to freak you out. Because you figure if I preach too much grace, people won't behave well. They will no longer have an incentive to behave well, and we just can't have that. And so we preach a gospel that says behavior is more important than grace. We didn't mean to. We didn't set out to do it. But our fears made us do it. This is really powerful. If you look at, we've had, I don't know how many churches now go through the Sticky Faith and Growing Young. If you look and we ask the people, what are the messages that have been most powerful in changing congregations? The first one is the idea of intergenerational ministry. We've talked a lot about that, about relationships across generations. The second one is when people realized they were preaching a gospel of sin management. That the whole idea of grace terrifies us because it's not fair. Remember we talked about that last night? It's not fair. And the more that you think you have control, the more you want things to be fair. If you start preaching a gospel of grace, you're going to worry that your 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 17-year-olds that are going to hear that might take that as an invitation to keep on sinning and knowing that I can just always be forgiven. I was talking at one point with my friend Dave Rohr, who used to be a church pastor here. And those of you who remember Dave will always remember two things about Dave. His bald head and his laugh. You know what I'm talking about? Dave will always say something funny. So we were talking about the gospel of sin management. And he said, well, of course we have the gospel of sin management. Because every youth minister has the same job description. And what's that? Graduate sober virgins. I could tell you you're doing 75 things right, but if you're not graduating sober virgins, you're failing. And you could be doing 75 things wrong, but if you graduate sober virgins, we'll cut you some slack. That's how you know that we care about a gospel of sin management. And so what happens with our young people, with our young adults in their 20s, and with our teenagers, what they hear is that behavior is more important than grace. When it says prioritize Jesus' message, it needs to be less trite, more honest. The other thing is that all the research we've done discovers this about doubt. Doubt leads to depth. Let's say that Peter here is a 12-year-old. Peter doesn't look like a 12-year-old, but for the purposes of this conversation, Peter's 12 years old. And he comes to us with questions about his doubts. What is our instinctive response to that? We want to make those doubts go away. We want to crush those doubts. We want him to stay in those doubts as little time as possible and to move on from them. All the research says that's the wrong way to go. What that does is it creates a brittle, shallow faith. What's the best thing to do? Crawl down in that hole with him and talk to him about his doubt. Let him deal with his doubt. Because here's the great phrase, what the research shows. Doubt is not toxic to faith. Silence is. For example, those who are honest about doubt tend to read the Bible more. Those who unexpressed doubt is far more dangerous than doubt. Doubt that you can talk about is doubt that you've got out in front of you, you can play with, you can deal with, and you can move on from. Doubt where it's no longer safe to talk about, what tends to happen is people hold it, and then they run away, and they never come back. Yet we are terrified of doubt. If a 12, 15-year-old, 30-year-old, 50-year-old were to express some kind of, I've got some doubts in my life, what do we want to do? We want to make them feel better. We're back to Rocky talking about we can't handle grief. We want ourselves to feel better. Remember we talked last night about how you've got to get in touch with those feelings in yourself? It is theoretically possible that someone in this room has at some point felt some kind of doubt about their Christian faith. Can we agree on that part? I don't need anyone to out themselves, but it's possible that one of you may have experienced some kind of doubt at some point. So if I'm talking to 12-year-old Peter here, I have to get in touch with the doubt that I felt at various times in my life in order to crawl in the hole next to him and talk to him from that and know what those feelings are. It's not an intellectual problem. It's usually a relational problem. The 12-year-old is not some grand philosopher. They're not dealing with the great questions of the human condition yet. They're just feeling stuff. Just crawling in the hole next to them and feeling with them. Remember what we said last night? You don't solve the problem. What solves the problem is connection. God can handle your honesty. God can handle your doubt. We will not leave you. That's the appropriate response to doubt. I'm going to keep going if you don't mind. What makes good evangelists? Honesty and not doubt. Or not honesty and not certainty. People that can connect with others. So the next one on the list is warmth. We have this phrase that says, warm is the new cool. And the reason we say that is, when Christianity Today covered this book, the title of the article was something like, Put Away the Hipster Jeans. Because there used to be this sense that in order to be to be a youth minister, you had to be cool. You had to wear skinny jeans and have piercings and tattoos and listen to the right rock music, rap music, whatever it is. I'm uncool enough that I don't even know what music is anymore. But it turns out that none of that really made any difference. One of the things that you can see if you go on our website is you can see pictures of some of the youth ministers. One of them is a 55-year-old single woman with a bad haircut. And she is one of the most effective youth ministers because she can crawl into the hole with people and care for them. And that changes people's lives. It's not about a hipster haircut or skinny jeans. Warmth is the new cool. Do you know what it means to have a warm response to somebody? Have you ever walked into a building, like a business or something, and had someone come and greet you in a warm way? Do you know what I'm talking about with that? What does warmth look like? Give me an example. Somebody give me an example of warmth. Smile. What else? Reach out. It's not an icky kind of a smile that says, I want to manipulate you. It's the kind of smile that says, I am glad to see you. Know their name. Recognize, the most important thing that you can say to somebody is with everything in your being, I am glad I just ran into you. That fuels connection even before you've said a word. You know how to give off all sorts of nonverbal cues that say, don't bother me. You also know how to give off lots of nonverbal cues that say, I'm so pleased to see you. Warmth. The congregations that did score well on warmth do very well on lots of the other things, because warmth comes from within. Oftentimes when we interviewed pastors, we asked them, what's the most important thing for reaching out to young people, anybody under 35 in this case? And they said, for the first things that came up was music. You got to have the right music. When we asked people under 35, what do they care for in churches? Only 12% of them said it was said something about music or worship style. Warm people singing hymns is more powerful than plastic people singing the right songs. What fuels growth is connection. Now, here's what's going to happen. If you genuinely are connected with people, you're going to start to be interested in the things that matter to them. I've told you that I have 2 daughters. One's 24, one's 21. I am interested in their lives. We talk about stuff, and it turns out that I have to learn things I don't know anything about. So, for example, because I live in a family of girls, I am conversant about color, fashion, and sewing. I can talk to you about A-line dresses. I can talk to you about boat necks, or I can talk about cap sleeves, or I know what ruching is. I can be sent to the store and get a jewel tone of a particular thread. I mean, I'm conversant. Do you think I care about any of this? Why do I care? Because they do. The joke we have in our family is, I live in a family of girls, so I know what ruching is. If we lived in a family of boys, my wife would know how to hedge a pick and roll. But I got nobody to talk about basketball with, because they all looked at their mom and they looked at their dad and they said, Mom's cooler, we'll be like her. From a very young age. And they were right. But why do I know so much about this stuff? Because I listen and I care. I can't help it. We were on a vacation at one point. We were staying down at the beach in Oxnard, and girls were probably 21 and 18, something like that. And we were laying on our bed, Jeannie and I, reading, and the girls came in and started talking. And at one point, one of them looked up and they asked what color we should call the color of the wall. And, so somebody said seafoam. We had a 20-minute conversation about what color that wall was, and everybody was interested. I can either go along for the ride or not. Was I that interested? I actually became interested. Why? Because I care about those people. My daughter started listening to the musical Hamilton a few years ago. So what did I do? I started listening to Hamilton. There's this wonderful article that Joe Pasnosky, a writer for Sports Illustrated, wrote about taking his daughter to see Hamilton. I have read it 4 or 5 times. I have finally achieved I can read it without crying. It took me 4 or 5 times to do it, because it's all about the connection that he has with his daughter as she's going through tough times. Warmth fuels connection. Connection solves the things that you care about. So let's go back to Rocky's question about grief. Let's say something tragic happens in our world. Is that hard for you to imagine? I mean, this last month it was the shooting in Florida. We don't know what's next, but lots of tragic things are going to happen. If somebody in the church comes to you with a question about that tragedy, here's the thing that I have been trained to do, and it's the wrong answer. I've been trained to see that as a question of what's called theodicy. The question of, why does God allow bad things to happen? And I want to turn it into a philosophical argument. Do you believe that the person who was standing in front of me wanted a philosophical response to that question? Probably not. I'd have to listen a long time before I was convinced that's really what they wanted. What do they want? They're feeling grief. They're feeling anger. They want connection. They want to know, where is God in all of this? They want to shake their fist at God and say, this isn't right. And what do I offer them? Philosophy. It's dry and it's brittle and it's not nearly enough. What they need is connection. What they need is for me to get down in the hole with them and to feel the times that I was terrified or outraged by whatever tragedy happens. And I need to be able to respond with that kind of connection. But it requires me to crawl into the hole with them. I'm going to skip the conversation about the Christian practice of hospitality because that's what I'm preaching on tomorrow. And so if you want to hear about that one, you got to come back tomorrow. I am sensing that now is a time for a break. We didn't get all the way through the 6 things, but I'm thinking that this would be a good time for us to take a break. So, it is 5 minutes to 11. I would like you back at 11 so that we can start at 11:05, okay? Thanks. So, where's that handheld mic? We're going to hand it to Bruce.
You sure you want me to do that?
With fear and trepidation. We can always turn it off.
When's the next break? Just in a few of the conversations I've had, this sense like people are kind of wondering about the young people thing and what does that mean for the kind of thing you're actually asking of me.
Sure.
And so,
where's all this going?
Where's all this going? Do I have to spend time with a 15-year-old because they freak me out? And what do we mean by young people?
Well, and you said that you're a young person in this church.
And I realize I'm a young person in this church, and Scott and I are the same age.
Yes, we are. So.
Well, you freak us out.
So.
And I plan on continuing.
So last night, afterwards, Mark came up to me and he said, that they'd paid this money and they'd gone to Fuller and they'd learned about sticky face or growing young and they'd learned about this stuff. And now, what are they being told? That they thought they were going to figure out how to change young people. And now what they're being told is they need to learn how to change themselves. And the implication, I expected Mark to say, I want my money back.
Didn't I say that?
What's the next faithful step? The next faithful step is to change the people in this room. And to get you to be able to have honest, caring, warm conversations with each other. With even people your own age. With these young 54-year-old whippersnappers. Remember I said to you, you fail people's expectations at a rate they can stand. If I turn to somebody who has a hard time talking to their 75-year-old who has a hard time talking to their 75-year-old neighbor, and I said, you need to go talk to a 15-year-old, that would freak them out. That's like the next 7 steps. Let's start just taking the first step. If you try to take too many steps at once, what will happen? You'll fall flat. But what do we do in the church? How do we think change should happen? We think change happens with a logo and a theme song. We announce something and we put it up on the board and we have and it's this big old thing. And what are we saying to people? Come watch us make our rookie mistakes in public. In the most unforgiving environment you can think of. So let's take those 75-year-olds and have them go talk to 15-year-olds and fall on their face and say, see, I told you I wasn't very good at it, and then never do it again. Let's not do that. Let's take a project that says, okay, by what time will we be good enough at talking to each other that we can feel like we have warm relationships with other 75, 45, whatever-year-olds. And take that as your goal between now and, say, September. And then start a couple of projects. Don't tell anybody about them. Just start a couple of projects where you're talking to young people. But let me give you another example. How many of you have ever driven a minivan? How many of you have ever driven a minivan with kids in the back? What is it that you learn if you keep your mouth shut? You get to hear the young people talking in their natural habitat. And all of a sudden, you become Marlon Perkins on Wild Kingdom. See, you're old enough that I can make that reference. Bruce, oh yeah, Bruce, same age as I am. You can listen to them talk to each other unfiltered. If you want to be able to listen to people, one of the best things to do is to work alongside them. And then just start having a conversation. If Lee and Patricia had said to my daughter, we would like to sit with you 1/2 hour a week and listen to you. We are going to sit across the table from you and we're going to cross-examine you. How would that work out?
Weird.
That would be weird. It'd be like detention. But what if they said, we're just going to talk back and forth as we're driving? Okay. Do you have any ministries here? There's a zillion of these. One of the Sticky Faith coaches, or the growing young coaches yesterday, talked about how, actually it was Lisette Frazier from Fellowship Monrovia. She said one of the things that they came and they decided to do is always ask every time, who can I do this with? So they've tried to create a conversation in their congregation where nobody does anything by themselves. They do stuff with people. My wife is a computer programmer, and she works for an extraordinarily competent boss. He is a much better programmer than anybody else in the building. And so there's a zillion things that he does that nobody else can do. But that creates what we call the bus problem. If he were hit by a bus tomorrow, we would lose an awful lot. And so they've made a rule in her department, computer area, that Jeff never does anything alone. If he's going to have to go do something, he's going to bring one of his other co-workers with him and teach them how to do it. So that way it spreads out. Think about the ministries that you are involved in. What are some ministries that you guys do? Pick one of these. What's that? No, students' ministries. Pick something here. The Easter egg hunt. Okay. That's not even up here. Thank you very much. But
Preschool.
What's that?
Preschool.
Preschool. You know, any of these kinds of things. Part of what you've got to do is you've got to recognize that you expect adults to get stuff done, right? Bill's talked about adults getting stuff done. You're on the patio. I got to talk to this person. I got to talk to this person. I got stuff to do. What if you were to take somebody with you that was a young person who wanted to try and learn to do those things? Now, before I get too far into this, I have to ask a question that I know my sister knows the answer to. Have you ever tried to teach a 9-year-old to bake? Which is faster, doing it yourself or baking with the 9-year-old? Which is cleaner? It's amazing. You couldn't even reach that spot. How did you make it dirty? But by the time, when my kids were growing up, she would constantly teach them to bake and to cook and that kind of thing. And by the time that they were old enough, what were they doing? They were baking and cooking and doing this stuff on their own. And we're back to, we could have, when Donnelly comes home our younger one comes home at Christmas time, for example, we just hand dinner over to her. And we just simply say to her, you're in charge of dinner. And she doesn't experience that as a insult, like, oh yeah, I get home from college and I got to do all this stuff. It's like, cool, I get to cook. And she goes on her Pinterest and she goes on, all this stuff and comes up with all these obscure recipes. I'm going to try. There are things I can't pronounce that we're eating. Okay. Why has that happened? Because when she was 9, 10, 11 years old, that's when I remember when, so I was going to say when we lived in Connecticut, so it was when my daughter was 3 years old. I would be responsible for cooking dinner at one point, and I would sit the 3-year-old up on the counter, and I would start cutting up red peppers to make for our salad. And we discovered that she liked red peppers, that was and so she would start sneaking red peppers and eating them because she's sitting up on the counter. Now, my tendency as a dad was to say, that's going to spoil your dinner, until I realized she's eating vegetables. Go ahead, spoil your dinner on the vegetables so you don't have enough room for the meat. That's what happens when you take young people with you. So I've got 2 responses to you, Bruce. One is, let's learn how to talk and listen to each other. The other is, in the interim, just bring people along with you. Okay, what we need is some kind of, matching thing in place by which we can find ways that young people can be involved. But you can't make them cheap labor. You got to actually listen to them. Your only job can't be to sweep things up. Their only job can't be to go fetch this thing for me. It's got to take the time to explain stuff to people. Listen to them. The whole point of the project is to actually be with the kid. And then what you get done on the side, when a mom is teaching the 9-year-old how to bake, the whole point of it is not the baking. The whole point of it is the time together and the teaching. And oh yeah, at the end, if the baking thing comes out, that's a good thing too. We've got all these ministries that are going on. Food share, community. I don't know what community means. Community groups, small groups. So you have small groups. I bet some portion of people who have small groups have young people. What if every 3rd, 4th month the young people were a part of the small group? That kind of thing. Food share. Is that like food pantry thing? Okay. Now, you probably can't bring young people to do that while they're supposed to be in school, but it's a big summer. You can probably find ways to get young people involved in that. And think about the 900 different lessons you could talk about. Just as the whole point of this looks like all we're doing is sharing, handing out food together. But really what we're doing is this is an excuse to hang out at the same time. And all of a sudden, we're connected. And instead of carpooling, what are we doing? We're standing next, handing stuff out. That's what it looks like. That's not a big thing with a logo and a theme music. That is starting to listen to each other, finding excuses to hang out, to have young people alongside you. Remember we said the key word is with. We're not ministering to, we're not ministering for, we're ministering with. Can I keep going? I want you to turn to the page that says, after we've got prioritized young people, well, the churches that matter, or that really matter in young people's lives, they make a priority of young people. And the phrase that we heard is wonderful, is young people have a load-bearing role. I love that phrase, a load-bearing role. What we tend to do is give young people stuff that doesn't matter. Yes?
I have a question. What do you consider young people?
Anybody under 35.
Okay. Well, then I'm out of that.
Yes, you're out of that.
I work with the children, like I do 1st through 5th grade, and I'm hearing some of these things, and I'm thinking how I'm going to,
So
work with my little ones.
So you do 1st through 5th grade? What would it look like if you were, instead of seeing that you were just the teacher who was going to impart a lesson to them, you were going to find ways to, throughout the time that you're working with them, to listen to them and to give them jobs so that each of them feel like they have a responsibility here. They are now connected. So, okay, I've got to hand these out. Would you hand these out for me? Whatever it is. It's possible that you've got first graders who are still having trouble with scissors. What if some of the fourth graders were teaching them how to use scissors? Whatever it is, finding ways to push as much of it back to the youngest person possible. So remember I told you about the family that the 5-year-old is unloading the dishwasher? Whose job is it to supervise the 5-year-old? You'd think it was mom's job, right? Nah. It's the 9 or 10-year-old. And it's their job to teach them. It's their job to make sure they do it. And when they bathe, in that family where they used to be overseas, they didn't have enough water, so they would always bathe in pairs. And one of the older ones would be with the younger ones, and they would kind of get them through, and boom, 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 boom. How much interaction, how much teaching, how much connection is being built when you do that kind of thing? Now, I'm not asking you to take your kids, to have your kids go to the bathroom in pairs. But I am saying, what can you do to find ways to give them responsibility so that they feel like I'm a part of this thing? I'll give you an example for a young person. We'll call him Scott. At one point, when I was in high school, a couple of people came to me and said, you should think about being a minister someday. And I said, God doesn't need more ministers. God needs more committed lay people. Lesson number 1, don't speak for God. But they said, well, we want you to try with something. Why don't you lead a Bible study? I'm like, yeah, right. So what they said is we had a youth choir that would meet on Sunday evenings at Carol Seymour's house. You remember the Seymours? Anybody here remember the Seymours? They lived over by Elmhurst. And we would meet at Carol Seymour's house. And they said, we've just decided that there's going to be a devotion before the youth choir, and you're doing it. Now, they invented this thing. How much, how stressful was that? I mean, low bar. I mean, I had to, excuse me, I had to create a Bible study. But what did I do? They met with me like 3 times ahead of time as I went with them, and they said, this is what I was going to do, and they helped me think. I talked through it, so I wasn't just left out there on my own, and I got to try it. And I'd done enough of that when I got to college and I was in an intervarsity group, and they asked me to lead and talk to the group, I'm like, oh, I've done that before. And it just became very natural to me. Why? Because they handed that off to me. They didn't just hand it off. They invented a space for me. And I tried that at Carol Seymour's house when they cleared out their dining room, and we had chairs sitting there, and that's where the youth choir practiced. And I did this 5-minute Bible study. But that's because somebody recognized me, somebody saw me, somebody prepared me, somebody gave me a chance. Happened in this church. Was that really hard to do? Let me give you one other example of why it's important. Well, it's important to find places that are what we call experiments on the margins, places to try things out that are not in front of everybody. Don't make your rookie mistakes in public. When I went to teach my daughter how to drive, we went to the church parking lot on a Sunday afternoon, no one's around. I put some dirt clods out there in the middle of the parking lot, and I asked her just to weave in and out. At one point, she ran over one of them. We joked about how that was a whole planet of people, and now she's, all these people that she's destroyed, and we laughed about it. What was the cost of her making a mistake? Minimal. Now let's say that I wanted to really support my daughter. And so what we did is we built a whole grandstand in the parking lot. And I filled it with all of her friends and with all of her family, and we had banners and we had posters. We had those big pictures of her head, and her face, and we'd wave them. Would she feel supported? She would feel a tremendous amount of pressure. It was no longer safe to make mistakes. We need to find tons of places where we just ask people to come alongside with us, and it's really safe to do something stupid. It's really safe to make mistakes. Let's say somebody's working in food share and there's somebody next to them and they do something wrong. What does it cost us? A whole bunch of nothing. We need to find over and over again opportunities. Let's say that my daughter, when she was riding with Lee and Patricia, said something stupid. What did it cost her? Nothing. Now let's say we do it in front of everybody. Now I'm going to give you an example that happened at this church. This church was trying to support me. I was in, I think, 11th grade, and they said, we're going to have a young person read the scriptures this week. Now the problem is that I was self-conscious about something. I was embarrassed about something. I'm a smart kid who reads slowly. If we were to ask me to read a page of a book and you all would read it, most of you would read faster than I do. I'm just a really slow reader, and I was embarrassed by that. And so what did I do? I decided that that translated to reading in church. It doesn't. It doesn't translate to reading aloud, but I didn't know that. And so I was really afraid that people would see I was a slow reader. So I memorized the passage and then practiced reading it as fast as I could. I can still tell you, it was Romans 4. It says, what shall we say about Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh? For if he is justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. And I did the entire thing that fast. And at the time, we had an interim youth minister. It was Jeff Nelson. And he comes to me and puts his arm around me, and he says, you know, that was a little fast. At the second service, why don't you slow down? And here's what I said to him. Oh, no, I'm a slow reader. I need to go practice more so that I can get even faster. Did we have young people reading in church after that? Why not? Because we crashed and burned in public, and it was embarrassing to somehow to the church and not just to me. So, what would have been the solution to that? All it would have taken is somebody to take me aside and say, we want you to read in church. Let's practice a couple of times until you get it right. We'll take you into the church. We'll have you read from the, that's not that hard. But we didn't do any of that. And so the lesson that the church learned is young people can't read in church. That's what happens when you do your experimenting where it's not safe to make mistakes. So the last one I want to get to is the idea of best neighbors. So I would argue, first of all, that neighboring begins with listening. The best churches that reach out to young people care about being good neighbors. But it's a kind of neighboring. I brought a book with me that I will just show you. It's a book called When Helping Hurts. I recommend this to your local mission people. There are stereotypic ways that the Christian church has reached out to people in need, and we have managed to discover a lot of rookie mistakes and then get really good at making them. The authors' names are Corbett and Fickert, and I will just leave it up here for you to look at. They're both economists. And what they look at is what's the best way to reach out to the poor, to reach out to do work in missions. And one of the things that they've come up with is the same thing that we've talked about. Ministry with, not ministry for or ministry at or ministry about. Think back about what I told you about Connie, the woman at our church. She didn't just provide a voucher for the homeless guy, Raul, to get a meal. She listened to him, discovered there was a baby involved, got them into a different kind of transitional housing because of that, and listened to him long enough to discover that he could play the bass, and then invited him to be a part of what we were doing. Now, let me ask you this. If there was a person in your church who was 25 years old and a regular, a child of this church who was good at playing bass, would your worship band invite him, stalk him? They would go after that person. What Connie did is she treated an outsider like they were an insider. She invited him in. That's the kind of best neighboring. Again, I'm going to skip the part on hospitality. I'll talk about that tomorrow. Who is my neighbor? It turns out that that's a common question in Scripture. The answer to that question is the Good Samaritan. My neighbor is anyone who is not like me, somebody who's different, race, class, gender, ethnicity. Walter Brueggemann has this quote that I found so disturbing that I wrote it down because I think he's probably right and I want him to be wrong and I don't want to have to do this stuff. And those kinds of quotes are normally the ones that if I think about long enough will actually change me. He said this: so the mission of the church is always to be reaching out to the next order of Gentiles, to the next order of people who really repel us and we wish we didn't have to deal with, and you wouldn't want your daughter to marry one of them. And they turn out to be our co-conspirators in the gospel. Over and over again, through the second half of the Old Testament, we find over and over again the people of Israel being invited to have a different kind of relationship with the Gentiles. Over and over again through the book of Acts, we have the early Christians being invited to a different kind of relationship with the Gentiles. Think about how offended all of Peter's friends were when he went and stayed at Cornelius' house, and Cornelius' household became Christians. Was that good news to them? You let Gentiles become Christians? What were you thinking? And he had to say, I didn't do it. God did it. God did it. We took God's good news and turned it into bad news because we don't want their kind among us. The best neighbors are the kinds of people that are taking the gospel so seriously that we can reach out to people that we find deeply uncomfortable. I don't get to decide who you find uncomfortable, but that's what God invites us to. Now, I'm about to transition into the next thing, but I'm going to pause because nobody's interrupted me in a while, and so I got to give you a chance to interrupt me. Any thoughts or comments? I've beaten you into submission. Oh, we got one in the back. Ms. Ashbarger.
Of where they are now in their walk of faith. All of them are very comfortable in the kitchen because Bill and Betty Robson embraced them. They took them in, they baked cookies together, they had them at their home, they hung out in a rich environment. Dick and Ginger Powers did likewise in the sanctuary. They were all very comfortable, even though they weren't up in front. But they knew the rules of the game. They knew how to participate. Chuck is very comfortable outside of the Gentile community and belongs to a Japanese English church downtown Los Angeles. I said, you should be at Hollywood Press. He said, are you kidding? This church was a church plant from Hollywood Press, and it works for him. He said, they always find me in the pictures because I'm the tallest one in the bunch. Arlisa in Santa Barbara and her husband do a ministry to a senior community with meals and environment and playing cards and everything under the sun. Thomas works in Santa Barbara and designed a church that we were invited to at the grand opening. Let me tell you what happened. It's Presbyterian, but I won't identify it. At the end of the service, they said, we have a basket of keys at the back door. Please, everyone, take a key to the church. This is your church to do everything. Sweep the floors, read the scripture, sing in the music department. This belongs to you. Anytime you want to come in, you have a key. And that's the focus of what they got out of this church community by being part of it even when they were little. When they were crazy going to high school, don't listen to this, John. A couple of our kids had dinner before the prom up in the bell choir, up in the bell tower, because they felt comfortable here. I didn't know about it till it was all over with. But they felt comfortable here. They knew if they were reprimanded, it would be done with love. They left the place as they found it, and the custodian let them in. So I'm just saying to you to keep that environment going. They played cards with John and Patty Hambrick and the Roars and goofed around, did a lot of crazy stuff. But they were comfortable here with everyone, old, young, and all those in the middle. So thank you for sharing so much, Scott. It's great to have you back.
Well, thank you. What I loved most about that story was all the names. Now, I want to go back to your question from the beginning. What do we do? What do we can do differently? Where do we go from here? So let's start making a list of stuff we said. Number one is you've got a team that's going to meet regularly. I bet they would take volunteers. I see. Tammy suggests that I'm right on that one. So if you want to be a part of this, talk to Tammy. The second thing that I would say is you're going to need to plant stories. So you're going to have to expect that Tammy or someone's going to be distributing stories as the months go forward. The third thing is that this team's going to have to figure out how to get people like you all to practice just being vulnerable and showing empathy towards one another. Get good at it in this room, and then we can slowly creep into caring for young people. One of the things that this team might do is to start to think about how to salt or how to sprinkle in young people into the various ministries here. So, Kathy, can I use you as an example? So, you're teaching 1st through 5th graders. It might be possible that a 12-year-old, 15-year-old would come and assist you, and that you would not just treat them like somebody that would say, here, make sure the kids don't run away. Okay, I'm going to do part of the lesson, you're going to do part of the lesson. I'm going to do this, you're going to, and I'm going to teach you to do it so that someday I will no longer have this job. I'll go on to something else. And then you'll have you'll have another one cycle through, another one cycle through. My daughter Donnelly, when she was volunteering in Sunday school at our church, that's exactly what happened. She, every time she volunteered, somebody would teach her something, and that she would be allowed to be the teacher. She went off to college. She goes to a local Presbyterian church, and nobody talks to her. And so she decides that, well, apparently the only way to kind of get to know people is to get involved. And so she volunteers to be a Sunday school teacher. First day she goes and they say, okay, you're going to go to this class. She walks in the room. She's maybe a step and a half in, and the teacher says, oh, good, my relief is here. Says, that's the lesson plan, and then bolts. The whole reason she was doing this was to try to create connection. And what did they create? Whatever the opposite of connection was. They only saw her as a tool to be used. How long did she last at that church? Well, the thing that's really embarrassing to me is one of my former students was in charge of the college ministry. And so when Donnelly told me this story, I called her. And I told her this story and said, can you do something about that? I mean, if that were going on in my church, I'd want to know about it. And she said, oh, thank you. Of course we'll do something about it. She never contacted my daughter, and near as anybody can tell, nothing ever changed. Whose fault is that? All of a sudden now I've told a story where it turns out to be it's my fault. I'm the guy that taught this girl. I'm the one that taught the pastor who made all the mistakes. So we've got a list so far. What's the list? Form the group, work on empathy, tell stories, get people to work alongside. That means that that this team that you've got, the Growing Together team, may actually have to work like a yenta. You know what a yenta is? What's a yenta? A matchmaker. Somebody who says, okay, I've got someone in mind for you. And if that doesn't work out, does the yenta say, well, I guess you're going to be single all your life? Is that, the Jewish yenta, is that the stereotype? Is that they are not persistent at all? I want you to think about life as a yenta. Your job is to keep being matchmaker until you find some connection that really makes a difference. For those of you who are parents in here, and for the training that you would do for parents, one of the things that you can do is parents can talk to each other. So let me use the example of Kara Powell, a woman who is the director of the Fuller Youth Institute, one of the principal authors here. She's a member of Lake Avenue Church. She has 3 kids. One's in 11th grade, one's in 9th grade, and one's in 5th grade. And when they found all this sticky faith research about young people, what she and her husband Dave did is they went to about 4 or 5 other people, and they said, we would like you to be especially attentive to being in, like Nathan, their older son's life, or being in Krista's life. And they went out and they recruited people. So Jeff Matisich, who I mentioned, who grew up in this church, he and Kara are close friends. And so I believe that he's one of those people that spends a lot of time caring for one of Kara's kids. They just make it a point of making those connections. And he's done the same thing with his kids. He's located people, he's activated them. Matter of fact, here's the thing. They say that if you can get a 5-to-1 ratio, you're really on the way. You can find 5 adults that'll be involved in a young person's life in various ways. And it could be something just like a Sunday school teacher who let me work alongside her. Or it could be somebody who allowed me to work at a food share next to them. I remember that when I was a student here, we went on a mission trip. We had a blue Vanagon kind of thing, and we went, I don't even remember where we went, to be honest with you. But we went on this mission trip. I can't remember much of what we did, but I can tell you a lot about who went with us. There were a number of adults in the church, and they thought they were going in order to build something or whatever. I got to tell you that the purpose of mission trips are probably not to build stuff. There's a whole chapter on short-term missions in this book, by the way, if you want to read about how to do it wrong and how to do it right. If I had my druthers, and clearly I don't, what I tell churches is I love the idea of short-term mission trips. But if I were to do it, I would tell the adults that were going to be in it, we got to do a lot of training. So what we're going to do is we're going to invite all the youth that are going to be a part of it. We're going to have 8 or 9 weeks of training every single Wednesday night. We're going to get together and we're going to work on something. And so all the adults have to come too. And all the young people think, the whole purpose is this. Well, this must be a really important mission trip. All it is an excuse. All it is a reason to get young people and older people in a room where they think that it's not awkward. And they work on something together. And I would have exercises every week where little teams were working on stuff together. And so instead of paying attention to each other, they're working on this thing right here, but in so doing are getting to know each other. what will happen on that mission trip? Instead of having pockets of young people over here and pockets of grown-ups over here like a bad high school dance, what you will have is you will find ways in which they can actually have conversation together. The mission trip is only the icing on the cake. It's the excuse of hanging out for all those number of weeks together where they accidentally had to get to know each other. Darn. Then what happens out on the patio? What happens on the patio, they actually know the names of those people. They can call them by name. That's huge. That's so important. Can I give you one last example of how this church can do something different? I don't remember who told the stories, so this was at the last time we got together at Mark's house. So because I don't know it, I don't know if the person's in the room who told the story, and I apologize if I'm going to embarrass you. But at one point, we were telling a story where they were talking about how sometimes what we have to do is tell young people that they've just gone too far. And the example they used was that there were, on the patio after church one day, there were some kids playing basketball. And their basketball was rolling into the welcome cart or the welcome table or welcome wagon, whatever you guys got going on here. And the moral of the story is those kids need to know how to behave. I would argue that that's not the moral of this story. So first question, who put the basketball court up there and then told the kids not to use it? Is that on the kids or on us? The second is, why is it that making young people feel welcome is not nearly as important as making adults feel welcome? They don't tie. What is shocking? That I told the story or the... That we are built for us. And whoever they are need to conform to us. So I'm going to tell you a story that I'm going to tell on Sunday in the sermon. Let's say that I've invited you to my house for dinner. What's your name? Laura. I've invited Laura to my house for dinner. It turns out Laura's a vegetarian. Do I serve steak? But I was trying to do what's very best, and this steak is some of the best food in the world. Why aren't you grateful that I'm providing you steak? No, we all know that if I invite a friend to my house, part of my job is to know if they have particular wants and desires and to conform to those. That's just basic friendship, right? When I am hosting people, my house is not designed for me. Let me give you an example. My wife taught me a lot about hosting people. She comes from a family where hosting is an art. Ginny's grandmother was a Southern belle who, when she was hosting a dinner party on Friday or Saturday, would start preparing on Monday or Tuesday. And by then she'd have all the crystal and all the silver out, and she'd put a big sheet over it so it wouldn't get dust on it. And she would, you're nodding, you know what I'm talking about. That's how you do a party. So this is the family that Ginny comes from. And so we're hosting a thing at one point, and I'm cleaning the kitchen, I'm doing the stuff, and I go and I clean the bathroom, and I put out the little finger towels. You know what the finger towels are? And they're little paper ones, and I spread them out in this nice little fan, because that's what I've learned is, that's the height of that. That's really good hospitality. And I walk in there 5 minutes later, and one of them's all crumpled up. And I'm going, Jeannie, what are you doing? And she goes, I did that on purpose. What do you mean you did that on purpose? She says, you ever been to somebody's house, and you go to the bathroom, you wash your hands, and these nice towels are out, and you don't know if you're allowed to use one? If you crumple one in advance, then you've sent a message that says, yes, these are to be used. And I'm like, but are they allowed to be used? I never use them. They're for the guests. Is the house constructed for the guests or for the hosts? When it is time to host somebody, you reconfigure things for the guests, and you think of it from their point of view. We got things just the way we want it in our church. These are, it is calibrated just for us. And what we want to invite people to is say, you can be a part with us. You can come and join with us, so long as you're willing to be like us. Follow the rules. Like the music. One of the things that Mark mentioned to me at the break is that I gave the impression when I talked about music that music is not important, and that I would argue music is extremely important in welcoming people, but it's not the only thing that's important. But somehow I gave the impression that it's not important. Please, that's not what I was trying to say. But it's about hosting people. It's about hosting people on their... Oh, yes, sir.
So, Scott, isn't there a balance between saying we need to work so that we can host these young people well, and also making the young people feel like they're just part of the community? They don't need to be hosted because they're already the family?
A part of it is, I would argue that for the most part, most young people have already figured out that if I come here every week, that I'm going to learn the stuff. And so the entire momentum is already towards us. The few gestures that we can make to reach out to them are tiny compared to all the other things. Remember I told you about mental models, about, what's your mental model of a preacher? Well, for many of you, it's whatever you've seen on Sunday mornings. For the young people who've never seen anything different, you've molded like 1,000 different things about church already for them. If you can find some ways to say to them, you're important, it transforms things. So, for example, at my congregation, the children's minister decided to do something that I thought was stupid, and I was absolutely wrong. What she did is she created the position of acolyte. And so every Sunday morning, you have two of our elementary school age kids come, and they go down during the prelude, and they light the candles, and then they come back. And I thought, that's just ridiculous. I mean, it doesn't really help me. I was so wrong. I can't tell you how many of those kids feel such ownership for the service just because I got to do something in it. We found a way to invite them into something that sent a message, because there are 900 different messages that say to people, church is not for people like you. You don't belong here. Identity, belonging, and purpose. Over and over again, we accidentally send the message, you don't belong. You don't fit in here.
So, one of the things that makes me think of, because I think of these things, is the way that God designed the tabernacle and then the temple for the people, and then what Jesus does with the clearing of the temple. And I mean, there were places that Gentiles were not allowed, and it had to do with purity and access to God and being all that. But the largest part of the temple was for Gentiles. More square space was given to telling people who did not know God, you can come in here. And Jesus was not at all saying anything about you can't sell anything in the temple. There was a place where stuff could be sold, but because the space for Gentiles was being encroached upon, and God's generous desire for hospitality and generosity in that place, and for allowing a place for Gentiles access. And it does, beg the question. I mean, how have we created our own space? Not just literally the physical space, although that's one thing, but the space, the access of into the life of the church.
Well, I mean, the Brueggemann quote I gave you was him reflecting on the construction of the plaza of the Gentiles. So, I mean, what you're on is exactly the right track. Is there anybody else that's got a quote or something they want to say? I thought I saw somebody. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I just
There we go.
yeah, I'm just sitting here thinking, and this maybe it's I feel like this is the doorknob conversation. This is something that I feel like I need to say. I've never said it. It's something I've been thinking for years, and that is, I didn't grow up in this church. I grew up in a church in the San Fernando Valley, and it was around, I'd say, 1980 when I started to become aware of the line of thinking that we need to prioritize the people out there, not the people in the church, the people out there. It's around 1980, I think. And it seems to me, I was already out of high school then, it was just in the next 5-10 years I started to be aware of, I'm sorry, I'm getting nervous here. I started to be aware that the high school kids 5 or 10 years behind me were experiencing something different. When I was in high school, it seemed like we felt like we were part of church. It seemed like most of the kids who were in high school with me, they kept going to church. It was like 5 or 10 years later when I was becoming aware, even with my younger brother and sister, that they were like unhappy with how the church looked at them, and they didn't seem so interested in coming to church when they were no longer in high school. And I guess what I'm saying is I've had this thought for a while, and I think you're kind of getting to this. I think this is what we're getting to, is that this thing about the people out there have to have priority over the people in here. I think that there's something about the people out there having priority of the people in here doesn't mean that the people out there have priority over the young people in here. And I think somehow the young people who are in church now, and you're talking about 35 and less, that they have to be a priority. They have to be part of that priority too.
Yep.
So that's what I wanted to say.
I have a question for you. How old were you when you learned how to be selfish? Did someone take you aside and say, I know this is a skill you're going to need for the rest of your life, and I'm going to teach you how to be selfish? No. It's really easy to be focused on us, whoever us is, on myself. The hardest lesson in life is to learn that the world doesn't revolve around you. And so sometimes that's people outside the church. Sometimes that's young people that are in the church that already feel like the church doesn't revolve around me, and I have to conform to you people. I have no idea what changes are coming in this congregation. Neither do you. But if you spend time listening, if you spend time praying, you will discover that together the young people and you will figure it out. That's why I go back to the Brueggemann quote, and they turn out to be our co-conspirators in the gospel. I love that phrase, co-conspirators. The ones that help us figure it out together. It's like we're on a caper together, and we don't know where it's all going to end up, but we got to figure it out. If you spend time listening to your young people, you're going to hear things that you would not otherwise hear. Remember we talked about not talking about abstract doctrine or culture wars stuff, but what are the things that keep people awake at night? Yes?
So this has been swirling around in my head since we read the Brueggemann quote, is that comment of the next order of Gentiles. Who do you see that being then? Because if the Gentiles are the people that repel us and that you wouldn't want your son or daughter dating, who do you, like Scott, who would you think that is?
I don't get to speak that for you guys. That's the whole point. Are you asking who is it for me?
Yeah.
You know, in my life, there are people that make me uncomfortable. I'm not going to give you them names because, well, they live out there. But I know I don't want to hang out with them. Okay, I'll speak for myself. There are sinners that I think are worse sinners than other sinners. And what is the definition of the sins that bother me the most? It's other people's sin. The sins that I am not tempted to. What are the sins I am most tolerant of? The ones that I see myself. And so, oftentimes, the people that repel me most are the people who are tempted to things that I'm not tempted to. And so, it's easier for me to condemn them, to be judgmental, because, well, me and my friends don't have that problem. And I don't get to speak for you, but I can say that the sins that most churches are most uncomfortable with are the ones that are other people's sins. The ones that we've kind of made rules against, and we've kind of decided that there are some sins that are okay. Well, let me give you an example. I was working with a congregation this last week that is made up of mostly African Americans living in the inner city. And one of them simply asked, how can white store owners ever be Christians? What's wrong with being a white store owner? Well, in their neighborhood, white store owners are the people that won't sell things to young black men because they don't want them in their store. They just want them to leave because they're afraid of them. And if they can just make them go away, then we can do without your business. Now, that would not have been on my radar screen. That just, it would not occur to me to ask that question. But every white store owner that they knew was systematically racist against young black men. Not remotely part of my world. But for them, the Gentiles were white store owners. Because those are the ones that were like the tax collectors and sinners who were exploiting other people. Everybody's got somebody that they think those other people's sins are the ones that we should all be afraid of. I thought I saw a hand over here. Did I? No? Okay. Any other comments before I go on? I've got about, yes. We're going to wait till you get a mic.
Oh, yeah. There's people that you're uncomfortable with, and that is so church. Phil Yancey points it out. Whoever puts their foot under the table of your house is family. The church is the same way. We have coughing, we have hard of hearing, but this is life. And I think the challenge for all of us, especially me, is to love on those folks, to listen, to connect. Not always easy, but
not always judge. Because what is the stereotype we're trying to defeat? That the church is, and it is hardest not to be judgmental on the people whose sins we are most against. And it makes the biggest impact if we cannot be judgmental to the very people that expected us to judge them. Where do we go from here? We got about 10 minutes left. Yes.
Well, there was something I said to you on the break.
Okay.
I don't know if this is the best time or not to
The
bring it up.
doorknob conversation. Throw it in.
Well, something that's always been on my heart is there has to be a balance. You can't just swing the pendulum this way or that way. You can tend to go too far either way. And I think the personal prayer life and Bible life is just as important as community, because we talk a lot about community, and that is very important. And we talk about giving our best. But how are we going to do it unless we personally are filled up with the Spirit in our daily life? Otherwise, when we come to community, what do we offer? If we're empty, how do we feed? You know, I feel like we have to ourselves be having that relationship with the Lord in order to come and give and share and be community. He's the Holy Spirit. When you give him room to interact in you, that makes the body stronger as far as I'm concerned.
Is there anybody here who's going to be opposed to what she just said? I mean, the whole idea that we absolutely positively have to be grounded in our faith? Absolutely. Let me tell you about, I want to give you an analogy. You all have heard of this term Sabbath, right? Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy? I want to give you a different definition of Sabbath. I want to say a Sabbath is a healthy rhythm of labor and rest. Sabbath is not about a day of rest. When you're talking to a group of fleeing ex-slaves who have done nothing but labor for years on end, yes, Sabbath is about a day of rest. But Sabbath is about a healthy rhythm of labor and rest. And what you're talking about is a healthy rhythm of Scripture, journey inward and journey outward. Absolutely, positively true. But think about young people. It may well be that our young people need to learn a healthy way to labor as much as they need to learn a healthy way to rest. And where are they going to learn a healthy way to labor? By laboring alongside somebody else. You talked about a pendulum that swings. It's absolutely true. What's the question in our church? I think in this congregation, the pendulum is way over one direction towards aiming at a particular kind of middle to older age gospel that is calibrated for a 65-year-old. And we got the church we want. We're going to have to figure out gestures on the other direction. And those are going to feel uncomfortable to us. Like, wait, we just got the church the way we wanted it. And anything over here is going to feel like it's like, wait a second, are you sure you want to do that? We're going to have to be careful about the fact that even a little gesture is going to feel like a lot to us. And so we're going to have to do it step by step, but you have to recognize it's going to have to happen. We're going to try new stuff. We're going to work alongside people. I had one more section I was going to do, but I think we're not going to do it. Is there any last words, any doorknob conversations before we're done? This is a huge shift in the mental model. You thought you were coming here to learn techniques that you could perform on young people to make them change. And I am failing your expectation, hopefully at a rate you can stand, and saying the next set of lessons to be learned is not on them, it's on us. On the one hand, that's terrible news because we have to change. On the other hand, it's good news because getting other people to change is hard, but at least I'm asking you to change the one thing you can control, changing yourself. Yes? Sure. You're unclear on the telling stories part.
Yeah, I'm a little unclear on the telling stories part. Should these be our stories or someone else's stories? I'm hearing you say take a story that isn't our story and make it go viral. But
yep. I'm saying that.
What does that do? I guess I'm not seeing.
Okay,
I'm not connecting the dots.
I think that eventually you're going to have some of your own stories that you'll tell. But sometimes you'll also tell other people's stories. Why? How do you help people change? You give them an imagined future. You give them an imagined future, and then you invite them to live into it.
Are you talking about then the church as a whole gets this imagined future?
Yeah. So
of who we would like to be.
Exactly.
As a church.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if we tell the story about Raul, and to tell a story about how we invited a homeless guy to be a part of the praise band, and he became a part of the praise band, became part of the church, and eventually now is an upstanding member of the community who regularly participates in worship, and his wife is a good evangelist. That would not be the stereotype of what we expected in our congregation. But if we tell that story enough, it now exists out there as a possibility for us in a way that was not possible before. We tell enough stories like that, and we imagine a different possible future, and we can aim towards it. That's what those stories do.
It's like breaking through a glass ceiling.
It's breaking through a glass ceiling. The glass ceiling is an image they often used about women as executives. And that until you told enough stories about successful women executives, you couldn't defeat the stereotype that said women couldn't be executives. So the power of stories is it changes what we think is possible. If this team were trying to convince you to do something, and in your head you're going, that just can't work. That's not possible. We don't know what that would look like. You tell enough stories, and then eventually people begin to see, oh, we could do that. The stories become prophecies. Any other comments or questions? The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pray for you. So let me pray for you. And then I believe Tammy has some kind of a grand announcement to make. Okay, a meager announcement to make. But let me pray for you. God, I entrust these people to your care. You have always cared for them. But you care for them more than they can know or ask or ever imagine. Not only do I pray for them, but I pray for the people that are entrusted to their care. The young people, the 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 22-year-olds, 30-year-olds. I pray that you will be through these people offering your message of hope and reconciliation to a generation that is presently not hearing it. I pray that your gospel will take root and that your grace will change people's lives, and that they will be able to look back and say, God was with us. It's to your glory we pray. Amen. Oh, and bless the food.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to try not to get emotional because that's not going to happen, and that's okay. I applied to come to this church because I worked with Allison, and she showed me this picture of Marilyn playing ping pong and with our students that are now our students. And we were working at the doctor's office, and I was like, that is what I want to be a part of. Scott, thank you for helping us figure out how to be a part of that. Thank you all for spending 7 hours of a crazy weekend to be here. It matters. Thank you for that. Okay. Your mugs have another purpose because we're inviting you to take them home as a physical reminder. If you're like I am, I need physical reminders because life gets crazy, right? Monday's coming. Life gets crazy, and we think, oh, that was a great conversation. But it's there. So we're inviting you to take your mug home. Your mugs are not all different and unique for the practical purpose of you not drinking after someone else this weekend. Part of it is also to remind you that what you have to offer to God and to this church is unique. And your response to what we've talked about this weekend and what we've heard and what we've dialogued about is going to look different for everyone in this room. The other thing about the mug is that when my kids were very little, I was encouraged by someone to be mindful to drink my cup of coffee or tea with 2 hands as a reminder to take a step back, to slow down, to not have my coffee in one hand and my phone in the other hand, or trying to do however many thousands of things we try to do at the same time. And what we're talking about here at our church is slowing down, okay? It's not a to-go mug, okay? It's not a tumbler that stays warm for 6 hours. I leave my mug all over the house. And Jason's like, you're going to reheat that again? You bet I am. And sometimes we're going to have to go back and reheat it. And that's okay. But the encouragement, if you have a particular mug that you use all the time at home, we're not asking you to completely break out of that mold if you're not ready for that yet. You can hold your pens or pencils on it on your desk if you would like. But just to be a reminder that we're going to do our best to be present and to ask God to show us and to slow down, to not from one thing to the next. So thank you for being here. Bruce, do you have something to add? I'll talk about lunch. You want to talk about lunch? I'll let you talk about lunch. I won't cry over lunch. I might.
We realize this. We're kind of coming to the end of this thing. It'd be just easy to up and leave. We hope you don't. That we have Chick-fil-A here. You need to know something about my story. My story includes, of course, marrying Karen. Karen grew up in Virginia Beach. Chick-fil-A was in the South, of course, a lot longer than any of us had any clue of it. I married into Chick-fil-A. She worked there in high school, still loves it. We have planned vacations based on routes of where there are Chick-fil-A's along the way. And for so many of the years that we have lived in a variety of different places, there never was a Chick-fil-A until just after we moved away. And just before we left Wisconsin, they finally built one close to our house. So to move here where there already is one, I mean, it's just unbelievable. So I can say this, she would on, 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 I can say this.